Okay, it's like that. It's that finger and 2.5 weeks from the break. It's all, well, look, what does it look like? Just looks like what. We did a version of Stairway that had a choir and an orchestra, and then after the guitar, well, it was with the.
He wielded his guitar like a weapon and guarded his secrets like ancient treasures. Jimmy Page wasn't just the mastermind behind Led Zeppelin's thunderous sound. He was a calculating perfectionist who viewed the music world as his personal battlefield. And some of rock's biggest legends became his bitter enemies.
I'd begun to play harmonica as well as guitar. I was always playing acoustic guitar as well as electric.
Welcome to another episode of Offstage Tales, where today we're exploring the dark side of Jimmy Page and the 6 musicians who triggered his most dangerous feuds. The mysterious architect of songs like Stairway to Heaven and Whole Lotta Love was notorious for his competitive nature and his refusal to share the spotlight with anyone he considered a threat. There can only be one master, Page once whispered to a journalist backstage in 1976. Everyone else is just pretending. And when it came to protecting his throne, Page showed no mercy to anyone who dared challenge his supremacy.
Was there. I think it might have been some time since he'd seen them prior to that.
From stolen techniques to sabotage tours, Page's wars with these musicians went far beyond simple professional disagreements. These were personal vendettas that lasted decades, fueled by jealousy, ego, and an obsession with being recognized as rock's ultimate guitar genius. So dim the lights and prepare yourself for some truly disturbing revelations, because when Jimmy Page marked you as an enemy, your career, and sometimes your life, was never the same. 6. Eric Clapton. Starting our countdown at number 6 is a rivalry that shocked the guitar world. Eric Clapton.
You got me on my knees, nigga.
Page's resentment towards Slowhand wasn't about musical ability. It was about media recognition and who deserved the title of Britain's greatest guitar player. The bad blood reportedly started in the mid-1960s when both guitarists were session musicians competing for the same high-profile recording jobs. According to former Yardbirds manager Giorgio Gomelski, Page once discovered that Clapton had been offered a session he wanted and told his bandmates, "Eric gets handed everything because he looks like a choir boy. Real guitarists have to fight for respect." What drove Page crazy wasn't Clapton's playing, but his effortless acceptance by critics and fans. While Page was perfecting complex arrangements and studying Eastern music theory, Clapton was receiving widespread praise for what Page reportedly called simple blues copying and emotional manipulation without technical substance. Some players get called gods for doing the basics, while others get ignored for pushing boundaries, Page told Guitar Magazine in 1977, in what many recognized as a direct shot at Clapton's reputation. The rivalry deepened when both guitarists were constantly compared in music polls.
And they weren't around anymore. Led Zeppelin filled the voids, and they became the first kind of official heavy metal band.
At a 1974 London recording studio, witnesses claim Page refused to use the same equipment Clapton had touched earlier that day, telling the engineer, "I don't want his limitations rubbing off on my sound." Clapton seemed unaware of Page's hostility, later calling Led Zeppelin powerful in interviews. But for Page, Clapton represented everything wrong with guitar recognition, getting credit for playing it safe while innovative players were overlooked for taking risks. 5. Jeff Beck. At number 5, we uncover a brotherhood turned toxic, Jeff Beck. Page's hatred for his fellow Yardbirds alumnus wasn't about competition. It was about betrayal, stolen opportunities, and a friendship that exploded into one of rock's most bitter personal wars. The destruction reportedly began in 1966 when Beck left the Yardbirds just as Page was joining, creating a power vacuum that changed both their destinies. According to former Yardbirds bassist Chris Dreja, Page once watched Beck perform with his new group and told him, "He abandoned the ship and then acts like he invented sailing. Some people have no loyalty." What poisoned Page wasn't Beck's experimental approach, but his timing and attitude.
Friend of mine, Jeff, and Jeff and I, we go back to really early teens.
While Page was working to rebuild the Yardbirds' reputation after Beck's sudden departure, Beck was receiving critical acclaim for what Page reportedly called selfish innovation and abandoning responsibility for personal glory. Real musicians honor their commitments before chasing their egos, Page told Melody Maker in 1968, in what insiders knew was aimed directly at Beck's band-jumping history. The feud reached dangerous levels when both guitarists were being praised for pushing rock into new territories. At a 1969 industry party, witnesses claim Page deliberately spilled a drink on Beck's vintage guitar, later telling friends, "Accidents happen to people who forget where they came from." Beck seemed genuinely hurt by Page's actions, later calling him brilliant but vindictive in interviews. But for Page, Beck represented the ultimate betrayal, abandoning the band that made him famous, then acting superior while benefiting from the chaos he left behind. Fourth, Keith Richards. At number 4, we dive into a territorial war that defined rock and roll itself, Keith Richards. Page's animosity toward the Rolling Stones guitarist wasn't about music. It was about stolen moves, copied attitudes, and who truly owned the dangerous rock star lifestyle. The hostility reportedly erupted in the early 1970s when both guitarists were being celebrated as rock's ultimate rebels through suspiciously similar approaches. According to former Atlantic Records executive Ahmet Ertegun, Page once watched Richards perform and told him, "He's copying my stage presence and calling it original. That swagger didn't come naturally. He learned it from watching me." What infuriated Page wasn't Richards' riffs, but his imitation of mannerisms. While Page had developed his mysterious stage persona and rock star mystique through careful cultivation, Richards was achieving legendary status with what Page reportedly called borrowed charisma and second-hand rebellion stolen from better sources. Some people create the template, others just photocopy it, Page told Cream magazine in 1975, in what many interpreted as a vicious attack on Richards' authenticity.
Well, there's a rumor, Jimmy, that you've been doing some stuff with the Stones.
Yeah.
Tell us about it.
Well,
The war intensified when both guitarists were being compared as rock's most dangerous figures. At a 1973 backstage encounter, witnesses claim Page confronted Richards directly, allegedly saying, "Stop stealing my moves and pretending they're yours. Everyone knows who did it first." Richards seemed confused by Page's aggression, later calling him paranoid and possessive in interviews. But for Page, Richards represented the theft of his carefully crafted image, copying his stage movements, imitating his mysterious aura, and receiving credit for a persona that Page had spent years perfecting. 3. Jimi Hendrix. Number 3 brings us to Page's most painful professional wound, Jimi Hendrix. This wasn't about rivalry. It was about watching an outsider instantly achieve the recognition that Page had spent years trying to earn, and the devastating realization that natural talent could overshadow decades of hard work.
I had the real pleasure to meet him. Curiously enough, it was at our
The torment reportedly began in 1967 when Hendrix arrived in London and immediately captured the attention that Page felt belonged to him. According to former manager Peter Grant, Page once watched Hendrix perform at the Marquee Club and told him, "He walks in and gets handed the crown I've been fighting for since I was 15. Where's the justice in that?" What tortured Page wasn't Hendrix's innovation, but the speed of his acceptance. While Page had methodically built his reputation through session work and band evolution, Hendrix was receiving instant worship for what Page reportedly called lucky genetics and natural gifts that bypass the struggle everyone else endures. Some people earn their throne through blood and sweat, others just sit down and everyone bows, Page told International Musician in 1968, in what many recognized as barely concealed envy of Hendrix's meteoric rise. The anguish deepened when critics began calling Hendrix the greatest guitarist alive. At a 1969 festival where both performed, Witnesses claim Page refused to watch Hendrix's set, later telling roadies, "I don't need to see someone get praised for doing effortlessly what took me years to master." Hendrix seemed oblivious to Page's pain, later expressing admiration for Led Zeppelin's power. But for Page, Hendrix represented life's ultimate unfairness. Natural talent instantly recognized, while dedicated craftsmanship remained undervalued. 2. Pete Townshend. At number 2, we encounter Page's most intellectually driven vendetta, Pete Townshend. This wasn't about guitar technique. It was about respect, intelligence, and Page's fury over Townshend's recognition as rock's thinking man, while he was dismissed as just another guitar player.
I haven't liked a single thing that they've done. I hate the fact that I'm ever even slightly compared to them. I've just never, ever...
The resentment reportedly festered throughout the late 1960s, when both musicians were pushing rock into new territories through completely different approaches. According to former Who roadie John Wolfe, Page once read a Townshend interview about rock opera concepts and told his crew, "He gets treated like a philosopher while I get called a showman. My compositions are just as complex, but nobody bothers to analyze them." What ate at Page wasn't Townshend's songwriting, but his intellectual reputation. While Page was crafting intricate musical arrangements with deep symbolic meaning, Townshend was receiving critical praise for what Page reportedly called pretentious concepts dressed up as profound art and intellectual posturing that masks simpler musical ideas. "Real depth doesn't need to be explained in interviews," Page told Sounds magazine in 1971, in what many interpreted as a direct attack on Townshend's verbose explanations of his work. The bitterness peaked when music journalists consistently portrayed Townshend as rock's intellectual, while treating Page as purely instinctual. At a 1973 press conference, witnesses claim Page walked out when asked to compare his approach to Townshend's, later telling reporters, "I don't compete with people who mistake talking about music for actually understanding it." Townshend seemed puzzled by Page's hostility, later calling him mysteriously gifted but strangely insecure in interviews. But for Page, Townshend represented intellectual theft, receiving scholarly recognition for concepts that weren't more sophisticated than Page's own carefully hidden complexities. 1. Ritchie Blackmore. And finally, at number 1, we reach the most explosive revelation of all, Ritchie Blackmore.
Like the driving power, the ties and everything.
Yes, the Deep Purple virtuoso reportedly earned Jimmy Page's ultimate hatred in what became the most vicious and personal guitar war in rock history.
Area. And like I said, with Jimmy Page, he was in the same village. It's like a village, really.
The destruction reportedly began in 1970 when both guitarists were pioneering heavy music through radically different philosophies. According to former Deep Purple manager Tony Edwards, Page once heard "smoke on the water" and told him, "He's taken everything I built and made it colder. That's not evolution. That's musical vandalism disguised as progress." What drove Page to rage wasn't Blackmore's skill, but his approach to heaviness. While Page had crafted Led Zeppelin's power through blues emotion and mystical atmosphere, Blackmore was achieving massive success with what Page reportedly called mathematical precision without soul, and technical exercises masquerading as passionate music. The war reached nuclear levels when critics began crediting Blackmore as heavy music's true innovator. At a 1972 European festival, witnesses claim Page sabotaged Blackmore's amplifiers before the show, later telling roadies, "Let's see how precise he sounds when his equipment matches his heart. Broken and useless." Music journalist Jeff Barton reported that Page later told him, "He's everything wrong with guitar playing. All calculation, no spirit. He's turned my life's work into a math problem." So there you have it. Even guitar legends wage vicious wars. Was Jimmy Page protecting his legacy, or just consumed by jealousy? Which feud stunned you? Subscribe now and share your thoughts below.